from non-research related endowments, but the bulk of our special purpose goes towards Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. These four budgets are all restricted, and the resources are allocated within these funds to the specific purposes for which they're intended. The budget model, again, guides how we allocate our operating budget, which is about 58% of our consolidated budget. So if you were to look at the consolidated budget, it's about $1.9 billion. Our operating budget all in is about $1.1 billion. And the allocations occur across two main groups. So obviously the academic side of the organization, the faculties predominantly, and the central units. It's important to note, however, just so we understand what we mean by central units. Central units include services such as libraries, student services, IT, facilities and operations. And in fact, 40% of what we would consider to be central units consist of libraries and facilities and operations. So, very clearly, big chunks that we consider central that really do go directly. They're not even arm's length away from the core mission of teaching and research. Next slide, please. Just want to chat a little bit about some history here. So historically, we have allocated our operating budget to faculties and central units based on historical budgets, and we call that incremental budgeting. Now, essentially, all organizational units do receive their budget from the previous year with incremental adjustments as required to reflect the overall changes in the operating income expenditures. When you're in that incremental mode, it's all kind of backwards looking predominantly. Now, the historical budgets were based on an accumulation of past decisions, right? Because you're looking in that rearview mirror. We weren't really connected to the current level of activity that's being performed in the organization. And that type of budget modeling or budgeting results in significant financial measures for certain areas of the organization. In 2017, the university decided to move away from this sort of outdated incremental approach and work to adopt an activity-based budget model. For the purposes of today, you'll hear us talk about budget model 1.0. You can see that on the screen here. And we'll talk about budget model 2.0 on the right hand, 1.0 being on the left hand, 2.0 being on the right hand side. And so what we did then and what we're continuing to do now does follow the path that's been set by other universities. You would see very, very similar models at U of T, UBC, Queen's, USask, SFU, and McMaster all use similar concepts. And that being having moved from this outdated mode of incremental budgeting into activity-based models. We conducted for budget model 1.0, we conducted about 3 years worth of research before my time. And there was extensive engagement that took place at the time to explore what alternatives existed for incremental models. Those all came together in a new budget model. It was an activity-based, and it was implemented, unfortunately, only for 1 year in fiscal year 2021. After fiscal year 2020-21, our provincial grant, as everybody knows, was cut. It was cut very deep. It was cut very fast. And in response to that, we needed to implement across the board cuts to base operating budgets, and that was across all faculties and units. Over the coming 2 years, to adjust to the cuts, we implemented 2 consecutive years of incremental budget. The fundamentals of budget model 1.0 as we knew it just didn't work with the degree of government grant funding that we had. In the coming fiscal, for fiscal 23-24, we carried forward the base operating budgets from the prior year with some adjustments to the mechanics of the model. And so you would consider that to be sort of a third year of an incremental budget model, and that was done while we took the time to properly consult and design budget model 2.0. So as we are looking forward now, we have commenced the project to develop a revised budget model. It builds off of the good work that was done in budget model 1.0, and we are looking to have it implemented for this coming fall is when the work will start, and it will be implemented for fiscal year 24-25. Next slide, please. So why do we need to change? I talked a little bit about that, but historically, the provincial government grant accounted for about half of our total revenues. And the previous budget model, 1.0, was designed with that as its context. And in response to COVID-19 and the provincial government budget cuts that we saw, we established goals to grow and diversify our revenues. Right, we had to find different streams of revenue or more streams of revenue to fund our operations. The government grant that we have is predicted to stay lower than it was. This isn't just a trend in Alberta; you're seeing it across the country, and that means that we need to think differently about how we allocate resources so that they best support our mission and help grow our enrollment revenue. Next slide, please. Under budget model 1.0, central units were funded entirely through the provincial grant. With the grant now having been reduced by 34%, $222 million, our new operating model, the strategic response to that was to centralize much of our administrative activity that was previously occurring in the faculties into new central service providers. And with that move and with the cuts, the government grant just doesn't have enough money in it to be able to fund central units just sort of off the top from that grant. So all across the university, all faculties, departments, and units have had our budgets reduced. Again, everybody should be familiar with that as we move through the last 3 years or so. However, central units had to reduce first, and then they had to grow. They had to scale back up to provide the services back to the entire organization, because services that were provided at the faculty level are not any longer. And some examples to think about would be, IT support, HR, finance partner network, communications, supports, student services, etc. The model also leaves portfolios and academic units. The old model leaves, or that old model of funding, I'll say, with the heavy reliance on government grants, leaves those portfolios overly exposed to funding shocks, like what we have experienced since 2019-20, and it limits our capacity to conduct long-term planning towards university goals, and our planning ends up being dominated just by year-over-year changes in government grants. It on its own doesn't secure sufficient funding for strategic initiatives, which are critical to us achieving our goals as a university, and it doesn't create the right incentives with respect to growth, right? Whether that be enrollment growth, research growth. So to adapt to our new revenue and cost structures and achieve our ambitions, we do need to revise our model, and that's what we're going to talk more about today. And Vern, I'll turn it back to you to introduce the group to our principles and how we're moving forward with developing the new model.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thanks very much, Todd. So these principles have now been endorsed by GFC and the board. And it was very important that when this work was happening, that we actually have principles, or how I would call them, lenses, by which everybody who's working on the budget model can really use as partly to help inform decisions that were being made. Now, you'll note here that the first 6 up to accountability were in fact approved prior, back in 2017, if I recall. And really, it was about adding the equity, collaboration, and strategic, which has now been most recently approved. And there's been a little bit of wordsmithing, but first and foremost, what was really, really paramount was the priority of academic needs, which is based on the research and the education that we do. And so, as I said, they really have been guiding the development of the new model, and there is more information on each of these principles that's available on the Budget Model 2.0 web pages. I know that on the Zoom, I think our moderator, Lindsay, you posted the descriptors in the chat. And ultimately, as I mentioned, everyone who uses the budget model is impacted by the budget model. These principles ensure that we're going to be aligned and rowing in the same direction. So the next slide goes into how are we actually developing the new budget model. And the design of the new budget model really involved budget owners from every faculty and portfolio at the university. And a real key part of the process was the creation of 5 expert working groups. The groups have been providing input on sort of threshold budget model design decisions that are related to 5 themes: how we share tuition revenues, how we allocate funds to centralized support units, how we're supporting research activity and growth, how we support strategic initiatives, and how we allocate budget using multi-year data and allocations to performance. These expert groups include about 85 budget owners and users with representation across every faculty and university unit. So what have we heard? Going to the next slide. Since January, as I said, we've hosted multiple sessions with each of the expert working groups, plus 2 broad information sharing sessions with all the expert working groups to share the knowledge and discussion across the groups and between the groups. Across these 30 meetings, first of all, I want to thank everybody who's participated. We've really received some invaluable feedback, guidance, and a set of recommendations to help inform the development of the model. Those who participated provided very candid feedback on the things that matter the most, and very importantly, highlighting some potential unintended consequences that we need to be aware of and to mitigate against. The expert working groups will be finalizing the recommendations at the end of this month, including a final information sharing session that we're going to be having in April. Here we're summarizing some of the key recommendations emerging from the groups. So the recommendations include support to have budget allocations based on activity. So as we mentioned, the teaching research service rather than historic costs. Support to tie a small share of operating funding to performance with metrics established collaboratively. And while the groups did not provide recommendations on how to allocate the provincial grant for teaching and research, they did support allocating in a way that recognizes differences in cost structures and research performance. Support to continue sharing tuition, as we introduced in 23-24 between the faculties and central units. Support to establish more stable funding sources for strategic initiatives and research growth, with a preference for these to be combined into one university fund that's going to be simple to use. A space allocation approach that will incentivize units to meet space usage targets and optimize space utilization. Support to use 5 years of data on teaching and research activity to smooth out allocations over time, and support for the central university units to produce multi-year functional plans that articulate service delivery priorities and investment needs. And additionally, we heard there's going to be a need for ongoing iteration and evaluation of the model into the future, recognizing that we're not going to be able to anticipate all the possible consequences of a new model. So Todd, back over to you.
Thanks, Verna. So go to on slide here. So where are we going with the approval of our guiding principles, which was received, I guess, final approval just last Friday at the board meeting, and the thoughtful recommendations that each of the expert groups is coming forward with on those I'll call them those major budget model design choices that needed to be made. We now have work to do. It's time to get focused really on the design. And so over the next few months, the budget model design group, which is a core group within the university, has representation from our resource planning and also from the Office of the Provost. So some key folks from my portfolio and from Verna's portfolio, along with Verna and my oversight, will be designing, they'll be testing it, they'll be retesting our new budget model. And they'll run the new design through a number of scenarios. We need to understand the impacts on the individual faculties and units. We need to understand the gaps in the model that might be there. We need to anticipate and mitigate any challenges that could arise with its use. And we aim to have that work all done by June, which will then move forward through approvals sort of into that mid-July period. From that point, we'll then be looking to prepare for implementation. That'll include planning how best to move to the new model, take a look at supporting all budget owners in its implementation for the fiscal 25 budget cycle. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that cycle kicks off in October of this year. During this period, we'll explore how best to move to the new model and any transitional supports that might be needed to provide more time for faculties or units to adjust to their activities based budgets and the spending to adjust to that new model. And finally, for groups like this, we are committed to communicating to you throughout this process, and you'll have significant lead time, training, and support on any changes that may directly impact your area. I'm going to stop there, and Lindsay, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We'll wrap up our presentation and we can get into some discussion and questions.
That's great. Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Verna, for that information. So now is our opportunity to have a conversation about the new budget model. We've received a few questions in advance, so I might start with one of those as people put their questions in the chat and raise their hands. So Todd, I might kick this first question over to you. So the question is, are you factoring in the ever-growing safety and security issues on campus into your plans and increasing the operating budget for U of A protective services in direct proportion?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Safety and security are such important topics, and whether it be specific to the heart of this question, which is protective services, or whether it be faculty, staff, student, public safety overall, I can tell you that has a very keen interest from the executive and our board of governors as well. So operating funding to ensure the safety and security on our campuses is provided, and I'll just focus specifically on this question because it was directed to protective services. So that funding is provided to facilities and operations unit, or F&O unit, as part of that unit's base operating budget. One of the expert groups, one of the 5 groups, has provided recommendations on how the model should adequately fund these central areas to meet the service needs across the organization. And the group has recommended that these areas develop plans that outline the current services that are being provided, what those evolving needs might be, and what future investment might be required. The functional plans then would be approved by the university executive at the President's Executive Council, and by myself and Verna. And evolving needs and associated funding to address the safety and security needs would then be, in that context, considered within the functional plan for F&O. So that would be the avenue to bring that forward, and I anticipate that Andrew Sharman will be doing so.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Next, we're going to take it to the chat, and I'll just read those out for those tuning in via YouTube live stream. So the question is about ancillary budgets. Have all of those been centralized? Does this effectively limit the incentive to develop faculty-based revenue streams? And that's from Sandra. Thank you, Sandra.
I can take a shot at that one. So there are what we consider to be the ancillary operations, which, yes, have all been centralized in Andrew Sharman's portfolio. But no, that doesn't preclude faculties from also generating revenues. And I'm just going off the top of my head, but for example, in FOMD, right, there's a dental clinic that generates revenue to fund some of its own activity. But sort of what we consider to be in that ancillary budget that I talked about earlier, yes, those activities are all centralized in F&O.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any raised hands, so we'll take it to some of the previously submitted questions. So can you speak to where the colleges fit into this new model?
Yeah, maybe Lindsay, I'll take that one. So colleges, when created, were initially treated as an academic unit funded out of the provost budget. So under this approach, the budget for colleges is going to be allocated off the top of the operating support grant before the grant is allocated out to the faculties. The colleges, as you know, are still in the process of evolution. And over time, we are going to look to see that evolution and how they're going to be funded. So aligning it closer with activity-based budgeting is going to be the intention. But as I said, they're still evolving over the next 12 to 18 months. So over that time, we are going to look about activity-based budgeting for them also.
Thanks, Verna. And perhaps another question that I will send your way as well to at least provide initial comments on. So what does this new budget actually mean for those of us on the call? What impact will it have on departments?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was was a great addition based on feedback from Chairs Council is that we actually invited chairs to actually be part of our 5 expert working groups. And so they provided invaluable advice and guidance input around those 5 topic areas. But the budget model right now is allocating budget down to the faculty level. And so it doesn't specifically dictate how each department is going to be budgeted. So it really is at this current time and foreseeing into the future and through the budget model that each faculty is going to decide how they're going to allocate resources internally according to their own strategic priorities. Now, some faculties may decide to actually apply the budget model 2.0 to their department, school level programs, while other faculties may choose a different strategy that better matches their needs and priorities. So it's really going to be up to the faculties to kind of make that decision. And for the central units, under the proposal to establish functional plans, each unit leader is going to engage with their respective AVP and VP to develop the functional plan, which outlines priorities and investment needs across the unit. So I hope that answers your question, Lindsay.
Great, that's helpful, Verna. Thank you. And we have another question via the chat. Thank you, Spencer. So the 2.0 based budgeting seeks to align how other institutions operate. However, the one singular difference between U of A and other major Canadian institutions is the consolidated budget applied by GOA. How will consolidation hinder the U of A under the new model, and how will deconsolidation, when it occurs, work to benefit faculties and academic units?
I can take at least a start at that. And so hopefully everybody is aware that the U of A has been working with government and other universities and post-secondaries in the province to pursue deconsolidation from the government's financial statements. That's essentially what we mean by consolidations versus deconsolidation in its most practical sense. In a consolidated world, every dollar that the University of Alberta spends shows up as a dollar that is being spent by government, even though government of Alberta's funding to the university is only about is only about 40% of our overall consolidated budget. Deconsolidation has had, I'll say, good support from this government. However, with some of the leadership change activities and so forth that they've moved through in the last few months and now moving into an election, it has not made it to the top of the legislative agenda. And so anything that will happen with deconsolidation won't happen now until after the election. And my crystal ball is no better than anybody else's in that regard. So we'll just leave that conversation there. In a consolidated world versus a deconsolidated world, there are legislations and requirements that the university has to follow. That means that how we spend our money, how we borrow money if we need to, things like accessing our carry forward funds, decisions on land purchases or sales, those types of things do have a legislative control over government, and they're not fully within the control of our board of governors. And so that does impact what we're able to do. As far as budget model 2.0 goes specifically, the model is again about how we allocate the revenues that come into the university. And so consolidation on its own doesn't necessarily impact that. Admittedly, it does impact some of the decisions that would be made upstream of that, and maybe carry forwards is a great example of that. We have not been able to access our carry forward funds, and you could consider that to be an input into the model. Maybe just while I'm talking about carry forward funds, hopefully people did notice in the provincial budget on the 28th and in some of the communications that we've done internal to the organization. In this year, in the absence of deconsolidation, government is allowing us as a university and others to, I'll say, make application to them for approval to access 15% of our non-restricted carry forwards. And so we were in front of the Board of Governors on Friday and got their support to submit what is just over $39 million worth of initiatives. Those initiatives will, have an impact across the entire university, and I think that in one way, shape, or form, every part of our community will see something in there that they will see of value. We will hear back from. We have to make that submission by the 31st of March. That's in the works, and we anticipate hearing back from government on or about April 21st. So more information to come on that, but I think that's exciting. Does give us an opportunity to make some investment and use some of those dollars that are sitting there to better our community.
Great, thanks, Todd. And a few things that I heard in the presentation were related to central units and kind of our university services. So I'm wondering if you can speak again to what a central unit is. We had that clarifying question by email, and how do they fit into this model overall? How does all that work?
Yeah, sure. So by definition, a central unit is a non-teaching unit that delivers services to students, faculty, staff from within the university, and all in support, of course, of the delivery of the university's core mission. So in many ways, this separation between faculty and central is, particularly in the new model, maybe even a little bit of a dated concept, and we probably do need to revisit the names that we give things because words matter. But it would encompass things such as those that you would think about, right? HR, finance, maintenance of our facilities, space, buildings, research, administration, communications, student services are in there. There are about 32 central functions and units that sit within the 5 central VP portfolios. So that's what they're made up of. As I mentioned earlier, when we think about sort of these central units, libraries, for example, falls in there. That might not be something that many people would think of as a central unit. You probably think more about USF, right? Todd's portfolio, but in our new model, those services are no longer at the faculty level. And so again, this separation between central and faculty is, I think, becoming less meaningful, and we probably need to revisit how we talk about that.
Sorry about the delay there. Yes, the one university vision. I agree there. So going back to the chat, in terms of the implementation timeline, when do you anticipate giving faculty certainty into the cost and revenue drivers under their control in the new model? Thinking about this in the context of the faculty making admission decisions and setting enrollment targets.
You want to take that one, Berta?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so the whole intention of the budget model 2.0, Brian, as you've nicely highlighted, is that you are going to be able to make informed decisions around those very areas, around enrollment targets. And so that's the intention of the budget model 2.0, is to have a level of transparency that provides you with the types of data and the drivers, as you said, the incentives to make decisions about what you want to do with the enrollment pieces. So that's intention. I think, Todd, we're planning to think about rolling out budget model 2.0 for 24-25 fiscal year. The model, as we consolidate all the recommendations from the 5 expert working groups, the intention is to do some internal work. So the design team, who's been doing a lot of work on this budget model 2.0, is going to be spending the next 2 months after we firm up the recommendations from the groups, spend the next 2 months to look at what the models would look like, what are some implications. And with that rollout, I think then we're going to look at, obviously sharing that final version out later on this year, and then making some more explicit information available for the community so that you can look at potential decision making for 24-25.
Great, thank you for that, Verna. And we're getting some great questions via the chat. So thank you everybody for the thought this morning. So next up from Colleen, with the evaluation of research supports, will the working group also assess how research supports are currently managed and financially supported by faculties that may benefit from users across the U of A?
So Colleen, that's a really, really good question. And I know that Amina's on the line, so I'm going to pull Amina into this, but absolutely, we do have to think about how we're supporting research across the university. It's fairly siloed right now. There are certain faculties who feel like they own it, although they're providing services across the board. So we need to make some sense out of that and make sure that any of the services that we have are going to be not just sustainable, but effective and efficient going into the future. So Amina, I know you've been doing some work in this area, so maybe I'll pull you in.
Yeah, thank you, Verna. That's such a great question. So I echo what Verna said. Through the budget model, we're also looking to incentivize research activity by having revenue partly driven through that activity. So that's one aspect. In terms of specifically research supports, that's something that we've been looking at in the VPRI office for the past year and a half. We're certainly working with FNO. We've got actually a project underway to look at how we structure core facilities so that we can support them institutionally across the institution with the faculties, of course. But there's also other central services that we're working on to provide that more uniformly across the institution. So that includes some of the research development supports throughout an academic's career. We're also looking at animal facilities specifically within the concept of core facilities. We're looking at how we provide more innovation supports across the institution. And we're also providing a lot more support strategically as we try and go after some of the large grants that we're hoping to get. So this is all looked at within the context of budget model through some of the revenue drivers. And at the same time, these are activities that are happening, in addition to the budget modeling exercise. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that answer. So I'm going to do a last call out for questions because I don't see hands raised, and I think we've answered all of those in the chat. So if we don't have a hand raised in the next few
New one just came in. A new one just came in, Lindsay, in the chat.
Great, thank you. So SET has caused a significant impact of support services at the department level. How flexible will the budget be to allow for the necessary growth in departments for support staff, faculty, and space to allow them to meet the growth targets? Oh, pardon me. Growth targets related to students, that's including medical residents and research innovation. So a lot going on in that question. Verna, did you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I would say that, that's one of the drivers, right, for the enrollment growth is to be able to bring in additional revenue. The pot is fixed. And so I think that's part of our challenge is that with the reduction in the operating support grant, that really the only way to try to bring in additional revenue is through the very traditional ways that we know of. And one of them is very much around the enrollment growth. So as enrollment growth occurs, the additional revenue that we bring in with that will allow ability to fund faculty renewal, will enable us to provide the types of supports that we need to have. And it was very important as part of our enrollment proposals that we had submitted to government that we actually recognize the need to make sure that we not only support the work that needs to be done to support the enrollment growth, but just also to make sure that we support the students and the additional students that come in, which is why, Melissa Padfield, in her role as DPA or DPSE has really been brought in to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. If we think about international students and bringing in additional international students, graduate students, postdocs. Again, all of that is a way to try to bring in that additional supports for, obviously improving research, and then absolutely additional revenue can also come in through research growth. So growth in general is not just about enrollment growth. Growth really affects everything that we do. And one of the reasons for the growth is to really be able to bring in the additional revenue, because right now the pot is so limited in what we're able to do that if we really want to advance ourselves as a university, as suggested by our university strategic plan, we're going to need to be able to be very cognizant about that.
Thank you, Verna. Okay, so this is related to activity-based budgeting. So maybe if we can start with another definition of that again. But does that mean people need to compare and prioritize activities within and between faculties and units when preparing the budget for the next year? What is the decision process and mechanism for choosing which activities to proceed with and which to postpone?
I can maybe take a start at that, Vernon, or others can jump in afterwards. So activity-based budgeting, just by very, very simplistic definition, is the money goes where the activity goes. And so I think what is behind the question is how are we determining where to increase or decrease activity, and how are we going to work together across the university? We do have processes in place already at the faculty level, for example, and the new college deans, vice provosts will play a role here in planning for what is that activity going to be. I spoke earlier about the functional plans that will be used within the central service areas to determine what we're doing now, how that's working, what do we need to do into the future. And those functional plans, the intention is, and still being built, but there will be some degree of sort of diverse or cross-unit, cross-university, pan-university involvement in determining what those plans should actually be. So they get brought forward by the portfolio. There's an opportunity for input and ultimately an approval that will take place at the executive level. So I think what you will see through this process, not just the budget model that determines where money goes, but you will see a degree of consultation and under the banner of one university, areas working together, maybe in a way that we haven't seen in the past.
Wonderful, Todd. Thank you for that. Another question that's come in by email. What other examples do we have, or what examples do we have of institutions that are also using this type of budget model?
I can take that one as well. I think I mentioned a few in some of my opening comments, but actually many of our peers have also, made the move away from incremental budgeting and towards, they might call it something different, but what is essentially activity-based approaches. And the reasons that you would typically hear cited would be, works as an incentive for revenue growth. It certainly improves transparency across the university. It helps us control costs, and it's also a way. And then one of the things we haven't talked a lot about here yet today, but one of the groups did look at is strategic funding, strategic funds, and how do we utilize those again across the organization. So many benefits to it. Some institutions that come to mind would be U of T, Queen's, I think I mentioned those two earlier, University of Saskatchewan, SFU, McMaster, I think I mentioned those earlier. Waterloo is another one that comes to mind that have made this move. So prominent across Canada, and you also see similar approaches globally. So not just a Canadian phenomenon, but all these organizations have adopted activity-based budget models, and we're aware that others that have not yet done so are looking at and evaluating similar options as well.
Great. So it sounds like we're all moving in the same direction. That's great. So just a question on centralization and how we factored in progress with that related to the budget model. There's some additional details as posted by Pilar that are kind of out of the scope of the budget model, but specifically how what we've found so far in the centralization of some of our services and areas, and how that's impacting or will be impacted by our budget model.
Again, I can take an initial run at that, and thanks for the question, Pilar. I see it in the chat. So believe it or not, the SET initiative, which was the reorganization initiative, only ended a year ago this week, actually. So it came to a conclusion March 31st, 2022. So we're about a year out from it. That's not to suggest that some of those services weren't being stood up prior to that, but really we have about a year under our belt. And if you've heard me talk about this in any other forum, you would have heard me talk about the pace at which we had to go. It really was an example of building the old adage of building the plane as you're flying it. And so we had 2 years. We had to make significant change, very rapid and very significant. And so we're in a state right now where we are working to further stabilize and bring sustainability to our model. What I hear from stakeholders across the organization is, yes, we still have some challenges, but it's getting better by the day. And we do have an initiative underway right now. It's called the Continuous Administrative Service Improvement Program, or CASIP, because everything has to have that cool acronym. And so you'll hear more coming out on that in the very near future. That's a program of work that's being sponsored by myself and Martina Kalkunas-Ruppel, College Dean and Vice Provost of Natural and Applied Sciences. So that's a little bit on the work side of it. Back to the question at hand, which is how does that fit in with the budget model? The connection back there is going to be those functional plans that I've talked about. And again, the central service provision portfolios will all on some cycle, some of this being figured out yet, but some cycle will bring forward plans that will take a look at sort of where they're at, how's it working, what are the improvements or changes that need to be made into the future. And there will be some cross university involvement in reviewing those plans and providing input.
And I suppose to take it even a little bit higher level, this budget model, like our budget models of the past, does not differ in the fact that it still requires us to make some decisions, and it will require us to. It's not different in that way, I suppose. Is there any comment on that?
I think Verna said it well about 5 or 10 minutes ago. The budget model allocates what we have, but it's still a finite pool of money, right? It's still a finite pot of money. And so, yeah, there's always, even in flush times, right? Even when organizations have increasing revenue, there's always difficult decisions that need to be made on where those resources are going to be allocated. And the model's intended to help us make those decisions in a transparent way.
Great, thanks, Todd. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, Verna, to close us out for the day. Thanks, everybody, for the questions.
Perfect. I just want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to come to this session. I hope it was helpful for you. And actually, if you can give us feedback, if you felt there were areas that we need to expand on, or other areas that we didn't touch, please let us know. The intention is really to come out to the community, to really share the work that we're doing, and to really make sure that everybody is participatory as we actually develop this model. I just want to also thank everybody who participated in our working groups. It has been really intense over the last 3 months. They put a lot of time, their expertise into it. And again, their input has been invaluable to the process. So we are going to revisit the model, as we said, to reflect on its alignment to the principles. Probably in about 3 years' time, we're still in the process of that decision. But we really want to make sure that there's a period of time where we could really try to make it work and revisit it to make sure that we improve the model as we learn, as well as hearing from further feedback. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us. Let us know any feedback that you have. And thank you so much for being part of our university.